Last week, we analyzed the announcement video that Joe Biden put together to kick off his presidential campaign, his latest presidential campaign. We played it, we paused it, we analyzed the different things that Biden said, and people seemed to like it and find it useful. So we decided that we would do that with a couple more presidential campaigns and presidential candidates. So we're going to continue our presidential video analysis project now by moving on to the announcement video that was released by Pete Buttigieg. Now, Pete Buttigieg, as you know, is the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. He's been marketing himself as Mayor Pete. He said, people call me Mayor Pete. I don't know if they do or don't, but he certainly wants you to. So Mayor Pete is running for president. He's heavy on the biography. He's light on the policy specifics. At least that's been my impression of him up to now. But I thought we would start out by playing his video and seeing what that might tell us about the thinking behind the Pete Buttigieg campaign. What's the strategy? Because a lot of times the simple thing like a video can tell you more than you might think. So let's see what we can find out about Pete Buttigieg by playing his presidential campaign announcement video.
The show in Washington right now is exhausting. The corruption, the fighting, the lying, the crisis, it's got to end. The reality is there's no going back, and there's no such thing as again in the real world. We can't look for greatness in the past. Right now, our country needs a fresh start. I'm Pete Buttigieg. I'm the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. When I arrived in office at the beginning of this decade, the national press said that our city was dying. People on the outside didn't believe our city had a future. We propelled our city's comeback by taking our eyes off the rearview mirror, being honest about change, and insisting on a better future.
Okay, let me stop right here, because we're already seeing some patterns of what Pete Buttigieg is really all about. Now, for a guy who's been very, I think, conscious and deliberate about avoiding policy statements, there are a lot of hints of policy in here already buried between the lines, and personally, I don't find them promising. First of all, let's start out by, he talks about the show in Washington can be exhausting. I'm not always fond of this kind of rhetoric. In fact, I'm decidedly not fond of it. Barack Obama used to be very fond of it as well, because it implies it's got a both sidesness to it, right? It's they bicker, they fight. It's just a show. It means nothing. Well, among other things, that's a statement of great disrespect and disregard for his Democratic colleagues in the House and Senate, because he's basically saying what they do is meaningless. It's just a ritual display. It has no value. You remember how Barack Obama used to say, well, my friends on the right say this, and my friends on the left say this. And as he stood at the podium giving the State of the Union address, creating a sense of equivalence that essentially robbed every policy debate of its meaning. But now Pete Buttigieg does more than that. He then very pointedly, in a period of just about 30 seconds or so, says the following. He says, and he's speaking from South Bend, Indiana, a city hit hard by the collapse of manufacturing, in effect a Rust Belt city. And they're showing images of South Bend as he speaks. So he is really conveying a strong message by saying these words as they show the image of South Bend, Indiana. There's no going back, meaning to a time when we had a healthy middle class built around the manufacturing sector. He says there's no again. That's the phrase he uses, which is a fascinating and to me, frankly, mildly disturbing phrase. There's no again, meaning that things don't happen more than once. He's really saying, for one thing, he's consciously, obviously challenging Donald Trump, who says, make America great again, but he's also challenging the idea that any kind of left populism can restore the manufacturing class and the middle class. Now, that's a very complicated issue with a lot of economic theory on both sides of it, but and it's a very sensitive issue, and it involves people's lives. But the notion of no, again, disturbs me. It strikes me as glib and ahistorical. It may not be, again, the way it happened the first time, but that doesn't mean that people can't look to the past for lessons of what worked as well as what didn't and draw upon them. Then he says again, even more pointedly, you can't go back to the past. So he's really saying, you know, that life you had before, you can't have it again. And he says, he just got through saying, let's be honest about it. I will be honest about it. So this is very much centrist, democratic rhetoric of the old school. But let's allow Mayor Pete to continue.
To a generation that is stepping forward right now. We're the generation that lived through school shootings, that served in the wars after 9/11, and we're the generation that stands to be the first to make less than our parents unless we do something different.
Okay, I'm going to stop Pete again. Sorry, Pete. If you're really into seeing Pete's video nonstop, I'm sure you can find it online. Now he gets into the generational rhetoric. Remember, Pete's main selling point is that he is under 40. He's 37, I believe, years old at this point. And one of his main selling points anyway is that he represents a new generation. He says a generation that is stepping forward. We're the generation, we're the first generation to make less than our parents. Were the generation that carried the burden of wars after 9/11 and so on. And I'm going to separate that making less than our parents. I'll start with the first. First of all, this is not an unusual playbook in American politics. It's been around for more than 50 years. Remember John F. Kennedy's first inaugural speech said, let the word go forth to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation. So Pete is saying that, but history is different now than it was then. John F. Kennedy was speaking in an era when politicians were older. He was running, he had just taken the presidency from a general, and he was a active military, U-2 boat captain, so he was in the field of battle. So it really was a generational shift in many ways, and his was a generation marked by World War II. So Pete Buttigieg seems to be evoking that by saying we're the generation that stepped forward and fought after 9/11. Not entirely an accurate characteristic in that, unlike the generation, more than 200,000 Americans fought in Vietnam, millions fought in the Second World War. So it's not the entire generation. It is a select member of that generation, including Pete Buttigieg himself, and so he did serve, and that deserves acknowledgement. But he says a generation that is stepping forward. He's not really saying why that matters. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. Every generation should be represented in politics, just as every gender and ethnic group should be represented in politics. That's what representative democracy means. But it's a content-free. He's not saying, until he gets to, and this is important, we are the first generation that's on track to make less than our parents. And yes, that matters. But why does it matter? What is causing that? Is it the cruelty or the selfishness of baby boomers? Because most of the boomers I know are not doing that well financially. Or is it, in fact, some other forces of, for example, every billionaire is a policy failure, for example? That might be another explanation, but Pete doesn't get into that. Let's continue with his video.
Broken. It is a season for boldness and a focus on the future.
Good leadership brings out the best in us. The job of a leader is to call us to our highest values.
We stand for the better America that we know we can be. That's our message. It's not even complicated.
There's a new generation of voices emerging in our country, walking away from the politics of the past and ready to deliver on our priorities. There is no again in the real world. That's not a bad thing. We're ready for a fresh start.
We stand proud for our values. Let's go show the world.
You know what? I'm going to really have to slam Mayor Pete on this one. I'm going to say this is the most policy-free thing that I've seen anyone, with the possible exception of Biden, but I think this is even worse because this is platitudes. This is empty platitudes. He's going to call us to our higher values, good leadership. That's what good leadership does. We want a better America. Well, how's it going to be better, Pete? What are you going to do for us? It's not even complicated. You know what? I hate to tell you, Pete, it is complicated. You're going to have to wrestle some tough issues, and you just don't do it here. We are the new generation rejecting the politics of the past. Well, why? What's your politics? You don't tell us. And Pete Buttigieg, it's time that you did.